Good afternoon and welcome to another Waukegan History Museum Lunch and Learn. My name is Ty Rohrer. I'm Manager of Cultural Arts for the Waukegan Park District and also work on behalf of the Waukegan Historical Society. Happy Friday to everyone out there. Now, before I get started, the museum has a big announcement today. We have an app. As you know, we, like so many others, have had to adapt to these strange times, and unfortunately, there are just some things that had to be canceled. For instance, all of our Waukegan history walking tours, which we love to do. So Brian Escobar, our arts and history specialist, has been working hard on developing the Waukegan History Museum companion app. So it has just been released as of about 1 hour ago. It can be accessed two different ways. First, being a companion app, it is linked to the Waukegan Park District app, and you can download that app from the Apple or Android stores. And you can download it for free. You can also access it through a link that Brian is sharing or going to be sharing here in the comments section. You can find it on the Park District website. We'll have it on the Historical Society website soon, things like that. So here you see the home page there. And what the Waukegan History Museum app currently does is it provides 3 of our walking tours for you. So now if you want, you can go exploring. You, of course, don't actually have to go out with it being an app. You can look at everything and enjoy everything from the comfort of your home, but what's the fun in that, right? So we have currently statues and buildings, parks, and also the Waukegan Harbor history. So those 3 tours in there for you to enjoy right now. And more things are going to be added here in the next few weeks, few months, and we'll continue to develop it just as more things are, just as we think of more things to do with it. So please enjoy that app and go back to it periodically and see what is new. But we'll also keep updating and let everybody know along the way. So Brian, wonderful job taking the initiative and working on this app for everyone to enjoy Waukegan's history. Everyone, round of applause for Brian. Woo. So now on to today's story. The Blodgett family. And today I'm just talking about really 4 members of the family, with the main focus being on Henry Blodgett. Henry wrote an autobiography, which we have, and it is wonderful. It's a great resource for us, and I will be reading snippets of the autobiography today. But I'll also introduce you to Henry's parents, as well as his brother Azil Zebulon Blodgett, because I just love the name. But no, he was important too. But the Blodgetts are really influential, not just in Waukegan, but in the Chicago area with a lot of different stories. And I'll get a few of those in today. So let's start at the beginning. And the beginning is page 1 of the autobiography. And it reads, I was born in Amherst, Massachusetts on the 21st day of July, AD 1821. My parents were Israel Porter Blodgett and Avis Dodge Blodgett. And Henry writes, my father was a plain, unassuming man, a mechanic, and from a long line of mechanics, and he was a good mechanic. He had only such a common school education as was given the sons of mechanics in the latter part of the 18th century. But he was a reader of good books and far better informed on most matters of general interest than the average men of his occupation. He was an excellent workman, and above all, an honest man. Plain and unpretentious in all ways, he had the courage of his convictions on all questions of public interest. He was one of the early anti-slavery men and courageous in the assertion of his views upon the sin of slavery long before there was any abolition of anti-slavery party. My mother, if I do say it, was a remarkable woman, a farmer's daughter. She was intelligent beyond most of the New England women of her class, a great reader, and one who appreciated what she read to aid in the duties of her life as a wife and mother. She was one of the most affectionate and caretaking mothers and took pride in shaping the minds of her children to fit them for the duties of life. She was also a woman of splendid courage. Few women could or would have done what she did, starting from central Massachusetts in the spring of 1831 with 4 children, the oldest not 10 years old, and the youngest but a little over 6 months old, to make such a journey as she undertook from our New England home to the then Wild West. And yet she bore all the fatigue, danger, and discomfort of the journey without a murmur, and was, I may say, the most cheerful and even-spirited person of the party. And when all the fatigues and trials of the journey were at an end, she moved into a log house, which she made more comfortable and homelike than any such home I have ever seen. In the midst of these new surroundings and inconveniences, she found time to teach her young children and carry their education on, perhaps as well, if not better, than it had been done in the schools we had left behind. And withal, no sick neighbor was neglected or went without care, and no stranger was ever denied food or lodging at our house. So, a little bit on here about his father and what he's doing in Massachusetts, and then how they get to Illinois. When about 16 years old, my father was apprenticed to the blacksmith trade with a Mr. Israel Scott of Hadley, Massachusetts, my father being the 5th blacksmith in his district line. After his term of apprenticeship had expired, my father was employed for a few years in the United States Armory at Springfield, Massachusetts, and became foreman of the welding room there, musket barrels at that time being made by turning a piece of flat iron beveled at the edges into a cylinder and welding them at their point of contact, after which the outside and inside of the cylinder were polished and ready for use. After a year or two of employment at the Springfield Armory, my father was sent to a new armory, which the United States government had established at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where he became foreman of the welding room, the same position he held at Springfield. He had in his room a bright, young, mulatto fellow, who was a very intelligent, capable workman. After a few months, he made known to my father the fact that he was a slave, that his master hired him to the superintendent of the armory, and at $150 per year, all of which the master took, with the exception of a few dollars for clothing. And as he saw that father was taking some interest in him, he finally expressed the wish to get free, said that he was capable of taking care of himself, as he was taking care of himself and his master too, and asked father how he could get to Canada, as he heard there were no slaves in Canada, and slaves who had escaped could not be brought back to this country. Father explained to him that if he would follow the North Star, he would sooner or later reach Canada, and told him if he wished to obtain his freedom, he must travel at night and along unfrequented roads, and that in time he might reach Canada. A short time after this interview, the young man was missing, and it was in some way divulged to the authorities of the armory that he had received the information which made his escape possible from my father, whereupon father was peremptorily discharged from employment of the United States. He then returned to Amherst, where he married my mother and rented a blacksmith shop and commenced manufacturing plows. But then eventually, Henry's father, Israel, well, he catches the fever to go west. And the father of Israel, he first settles at the Napier settlement, today's Naperville. And then 1 year later, Henry, around the age of 10 years old, comes with his mother, and they are in Chicago for a little bit, in the very earliest days of Chicago, where there were very few families, as he says, waiting for their father to come pick them up. And then they move into their home. Not too long after that, while Henry's mother, Avis, is pregnant with their 5th child, well, let me read. Early in the spring, and when the whole settlement was busy plowing and preparing the ground for their crops, rumors began to come to us that Black Hawk and his band of Sacs and Fox, who had been moved west of the Mississippi River, somewhere on the Des Moines River, was coming back into Illinois for the purpose of making war upon the settlements. A rumor of the same kind, however, had run over the country the spring before, and the Native Americans had gone back to their new homes, and we assumed that the present rumors would have about the same ending. However, on the night of the 10th of May, old Aptekisik, otherwise known as Half Day, chief of one of the bands of the Potawatomi, and whom we had seen a great deal of during the winter, as he had been often at our house, came about 12 o'clock at night and gave a whoop. Father sprang out and opened the door, and he at once began to tell Father that he was to take his family and get away from there as soon as possible, that Black Hawk and the headmen of his band had been at Wabansee's village, which is the present site of the city of Aurora, in consultation with the Potawatomi headmen during the whole of the day before, endeavoring to influence the Potawatomis to join him in the war which he was determined on making against the white people. Father at once roused the family. I was sent in one direction and the hired man in another to alarm the neighborhood. And by daylight all the settlers in our vicinity, not including Naperville settlers, were gathered and on the road to Chicago. And our procession had got well straightened out, mostly with ox teams. We saw old Half Day drop into the rear, and as we moved on, he moved on with us, not saying a word, simply following in our trail during the whole of the day. Our march, necessarily with ox teams, was a slow one, and at night we camped in the vicinity of what was then known as Lawton's Place, where Riverside now is on the Des Plaines River. And the next morning we moved across the prairie to Chicago, the old chief following us as he did the day before, until we were in sight of Fort Dearborn, when he waved us goodbye with his hand, turned his horse, and disappeared. So the Blodgett family go to Fort Dearborn for safety. And it's there when, well, depending on who you talk to, Henry's brother, Azil, is born. Now, Azil would later claim that he was born at Fort Dearborn while the family was there. And then that also meant that he was the first white child born in Chicago. But there are others that claim this as well. But the family definitely was at Fort Dearborn for that period of time as the Black Hawk War was taking place and those actions within the area. Then they returned back home after those troubles settled down a little bit. And well, it's at the age of 17 where Henry gets sick. And by then the family had moved on to Downers Grove. And his father was blacksmithing again, also operating the family farm. And it's around that time when it's claimed that Israel Blodgett develops the first steel plow used on the prairie. He doesn't get a patent for this, but the improvements were greatly helped all the farmers in the area. Then again, at the age of 17, Henry gets sick. So his father Israel decides that, well, it's probably best for Henry to go to school to get an education. And Henry is sent back to their original home, and he goes to Amherst Academy. And he's there studying for a year, and then he returns back to Illinois. And at first, he's doing the profession of teacher and also land surveyor. But then he starts to take up an interest with law. And in Chicago, he gets a job as clerk at the office of Scammon and Judd. And this is in 1842. Henry writes in the autobiography, "In the fall of 1842, I went to Chicago and entered as a law student in the office of Colonel R.J. Hamilton, where I remained until the fall of 1843, when I obtained a situation in the office of Scammon and Judd. Mr. Scammon was at that time reporter for the Illinois Supreme Court, and a large amount of clerical work had to be done, and I was allowed a small stipend for working as his clerk. There were at that time in the city of Chicago 12 lawyers, as I now recall them, and 2 law students beside myself, one of whom was E.S. Williams, afterwards Judge Williams, who held courts in Chicago and Waukegan for many years." Well, it is while he is working as the clerk for Scammon and Judd, when he is there by himself one day. And, well, let me read, see what happens here. Mr. Scammon was a very active Whig and was the chairman, if I remember right, of the State Central Committee of the Whig Party at that time. In the early part of June 1844, just as the presidential campaign of that year was beginning to warm up, I was at work one morning before going to my breakfast, sweeping the office, dusting the furniture, etc., as law students were expected to do in those days, when the door opened and the tall, gaunt figure of a man stepped in and stood one hand on each door jamb. He called out to me, "Is Scammon in?" I went forward and said, "No, sir, Mr. Scammon is not in. He doesn't get in as early as this." "Well, what time will he be in?" he asked. I said, "About 9 o'clock. And I went on with my dusting, and the gentleman sat down. He finally said, "Are you studying law?" I replied that I was, doing the best I could in that way, that as I was then ready to go to my breakfast, he could stay there if he saw fit and wait for Mr. Scammon. He finally concluded that he would come in later and said, "If Scammon comes in, before I get back, say to him that Lincoln called, and we'll call again later." I went to my breakfast and was gone probably a half hour, and soon after I came back, Mr. Lincoln came in again, saying he had ridden in the stagecoach all night and didn't much like walking about. He took a seat near where I was reading a law book, and after a while addressed me by saying, "Well, my young friend, I suppose you intend to vote for Clay this fall," to which I replied in substance that I did not intend to do so, that I was an abolitionist, and Mr. Clay was a slave owner and a supporter of slavery. Mr. Lincoln replied that he was himself opposed to slavery, but didn't see how the abolitionists could reach it in the slave states. My answer was that we could abolish the interstate slave trade and could also abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. "Well," said he, "you may do that if you get into power, but that will be very little toward getting rid of slavery in the states." I answered that at any rate I could wash my hands of the crime, and that was worth something to the conscience. Soon after, Mr. Scammon came in, and our talk stopped. This was my first meeting with Abraham Lincoln, and although we disagreed at that time, he was always after my sincere and earnest friend. And in about 15 years, he stood upon the same ground that I did in regard to slavery, and in less than 20 years, he had, as President of the United States, issued a proclamation abolishing slavery in all states where it existed. So that meeting starts a friendship between Henry Blodgett and Abraham Lincoln, and that was a friendship that would help both gentlemen. So continuing on, soon after I got admitted to the bar, I began to look about for a location in which to practice my profession. Quite a number of friends advised me to open an office in Chicago, said there was no better place for a young man to grow up in the profession than right there in the city, but I had not the courage to undertake the practice there in competition with the old established lawyers, and after considerable inquiry I concluded to come to Little Fort, as Waukegan was then called. And after some correspondence with Mr. Isaac R. Lyon, with whom I was acquainted and who had opened a store there, I concluded that was the most promising place for me to locate in. I hadn't much money with which to buy books, but I found an old lawyer by the name of Phelps in Chicago who had quite a good many books and no special use for them, for he had given up the idea of practicing his profession, and I bought from him a partial set of the Massachusetts reports and a few old textbooks. I arrived in Little Fort on the 12th day of February 1845. I had a letter of introduction to S.M. Doust, who was at that time recorder of Lake County, and on presenting my letter within a short time after my arrival, Mr. Doust suggested that I sit down in his office and put my sign on his door, as he had plenty of room and perhaps could be of some assistance to me by throwing business into my hands if I was capable. I accordingly adopted his suggestion, and his office was my office for nearly a year, and when I had no clients to serve, I worked at recording deeds. There were at this time in Little Fort 3 lawyers, Mr. Isaac Hopkinson, E.W. Hoyt, and James H. Trader. And within a month, 2 after I came here, Mr. Chase Gardner and A.R. Dodge. So Henry Blodgett is now in Little Fort. And, well, he really does become very successful there. Especially successful when he starts to travel with Judge Thomas, who goes on circuit to McHenry County. And Blodgett is able to get a lot of work in McHenry County during this time, but still is doing a lot in Little Fort as well when he comes back. And Blodgett's reputation continues to grow. And he's getting more and more law work, and important things are coming his way. And he writes, I was married to Miss Alethea Crocker in April 1850, and had just got to housekeeping in a modest way when Mr. Upton arrived on his first visit here. Little Fort had grown quite rapidly from 1845 to 1850 and had begun to put on airs of a town instead of a village. There had been some sort of an organization under a Village Corporation Act a year or two before, but it was not adequate, as we thought, to the necessities of our increased importance. And in January 1850, there was quite a movement to get the town incorporated. A meeting was held finally, and a committee appointed to prepare a charter to present to the legislature, which was then in session. I was entrusted with the draft of the charter to get it put through the legislature. There had been a great deal of discussion among the people as to the name. As the town grew, people were annoyed at the word little. They didn't like the word little. They had got too big for that name. We had a couple of mass meetings of the citizens to consider and discuss a change of the name. We found at these meetings most every fellow wanted us to adopt the name of a town from which he came, and no agreement was reached. So when we had drawn this charter, Elijah Ferry and myself, as Mr. Lyon had a pet name of his own which he was anxious to get adopted, agreed upon a final paragraph to be added to the charter to the effect that the charter should not take effect until it had been submitted to a vote of the legal voters of the town, and that at such election they should also vote upon changing the name of the town from Little Fort to Waukegan. thus leaving them no alternative except renaming in Little Fort or taking Waukegan. I was successful in getting the charter run through the legislature and brought back a certified copy, and an election was called and held. There was not much of a storm of indignation about the change from Little Fort to Waukegan as I had expected. They were all rather satisfied with our choice, although it had never been proposed in any of the meetings which had been held. But Ferry and myself had interested ourselves directly in looking up the original Indian name of the place. We had seen Mr. John H. Kinsey of Chicago, who was well versed in the various Indian languages of the locality, such as the Potawatomi, Winnebagos, and Menominee. And I had also taken a trip to Milwaukee and seen Mr. Solomon Juneau upon the subject. Both Mr. Kinsey and Mr. Juneau agreed that the Indian word for Little Fort would be Waukegans, but Mr. Kinsey suggested that instead of the terminal CE, we call it Waukegan. CE meant, as he said to us, little trading place, but Waukegan meant trading place. And that took the word little out of the name entirely, and also considerably abbreviated it so that the word Waukegan, as we finally settled upon it, means trading place. So there we have a major influence of Blodgett. Not only does he write up the charter for Waukegan to become a city, but he also is one that helps spearhead the name change from Little Fort to Waukegan. Now, in 1852, Blodgett was elected to the Illinois House. And he was elected on the free soil ticket, and he was the first actually to be elected on the free soil platform in the state of Illinois. And here he was clearly showing that he was an anti-slavery advocate. Then back to his law, he gets to work with the railroad company. In the summer of 1853, I was appointed attorney of the Illinois and Wisconsin Railroad, as it was called then. That is, a railroad line extending from Chicago northwesterly to Janesville, Wisconsin, and thence up the Rock River Valley to Lake Winnebago, and thence to Green Bay by way of Fond du Lac to Oshkosh. And I devoted my entire time that summer and autumn to securing the right-of-way and adjusting the legal questions which arose in the way of the corporation of the commencement of the construction of its line. And in the fall of the same year, I was appointed attorney for the Chicago and Milwaukee Railroad, a charter for which had been obtained in 1851 and lain dormant up to that time. But capitalists had come forward that summer and agreed to put up the necessary money and begin the work. And I gave a good deal of attention during the winter of 1853-54 to securing right-of-way, depot grounds, etc. between Chicago and the state line. The contract for the construction of the road was let during the winter of 1853-54, and work began as soon as the frost was out of the ground in the spring, and was pushed with such vigor that the line was completed from Chicago to Waukegan, and the cars were running the forepart of January 1855. So Blodgett helps get the rail line to come stop in Waukegan. He also helps get a depot built there, one of the nicer ones on the North Shore, actually. Some people actually were a little angry that he was able to secure such nice a depot for Waukegan. And also on that work train building those railroad tracks was actually Henry's brother, Azil. So Azil worked as a brakeman on the construction train, pictured here, for the Chicago and Milwaukee Railroad, which later consolidated into the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. and that Azil Blodgett moved up the ranks to conductor, and in 1858 was made station agent in Waukegan. And I'll talk a little bit more about Azil here in just a little bit. So there's just a small little paragraph here. Well, two paragraphs. In June 1860, Mr. Abraham Lincoln was nominated as the Republican candidate for the presidency, and one of the most exciting and interesting political campaigns in its effect and influence upon the nation ensued after this nomination. I took an active interest in the campaign, and as I was a member of the state Senate at the time the Civil War began, and for a year thereafter took an active interest in putting Illinois upon a war footing, and also took a good deal of interest and put in a good deal of work in obtaining the enlistment of men and the organization of regiments for the war. And during the war, I went to very many of the battlefields and saw much of our army in the field. So Blodgett is actually very modest here when he is remembering Lincoln's nomination and election. You see, actually, by then, Henry Blodgett had been elected to the state Senate. And on a side note, as senator, Henry Blodgett had played a major role in establishing the right of married women to control their own estates. But it's during this time that Henry Blodgett is actually one of the founders of the Republican Party in Illinois. And there's a rumor that Abraham Lincoln visited with Blodgett and other Lake County leaders during the second week of March in 1860, and Lincoln came to Waukegan, met with Blodgett at his home, pictured here, 404 South Sheridan Road, and Lincoln came to seek support for his potential presidential campaign, or for his nomination, I guess. And this meeting is said to have occurred in secret, but it's referenced in quite a few different articles, things like that. Some articles do have some quotes that Homer Cook provided. Basically, Blodgett invites Lincoln to Waukegan because, Blodgett supported Lincoln, but a lot of the other top Lake County Republican leaders were actually supporting William Seward at the time. So Blodgett wanted these folks to meet Lincoln. And upon meeting them, Homer Cook is said to have changed his mind along with everybody else. And just a few weeks later, Lincoln comes back to Waukegan, and he gives a speech to the people on April 2nd, 1860. That story is for a complete different time, though. Or maybe I already did that one. It's hard to remember which lunch and learns I've done already, actually. But on this April 2nd visit for Lincoln, he's not alone. Coming with him on this trip is Norman Judd. Judd was also in the Illinois Senate at the time. And if you remember, Judd is who Blodgett worked in the clerk's office with. It was Scammon and Judd's office where Blodgett started out his law career as a clerk. Now, the modesty here is that both Judd and Blodgett, they play a big role in Lincoln's nomination. First off, they really pushed and were able to secure the Republican National Convention taking place in Chicago. So right there, that helped support Lincoln, being his state. Norman Judd is also given credit for arranging the seating chart at the convention, of which he arranged it in a way where it was most beneficial to Lincoln. Whether or not Henry Blodgett played a role in this, I don't know. But Blodgett was a delegate at the convention and wholeheartedly threw in his support for Abraham Lincoln. And then at the start of the war, Blodgett again helps to recruit volunteers from Lake County. And as he mentioned in his autobiography, he did start to go to a few different battlefields, and the first being the Battle of Pea Ridge in March of 1862. Upon hearing about this battle and who was involved, he, along with Dr. Moses Evans, set out to really go make sure that the Lake County boys that were in that battle were okay. And two of Blodgett's brothers were actually in that battle. Those brothers were found, they were okay. Most of the other Lake County boys were fine at that battle as well. A little later in the war, Blodgett was in Springfield, Illinois, working on a case there, but he was very distracted as the news of the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing was coming in. So he went to the executive rooms of the State House, and there he found Illinois Governor Yates there. After hearing that the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing was over, Yates wanted to go to the battlefield, and he invited Blodgett to go with. Oh, so they are there and see the devastation that took place at Pittsburgh Landing. And then Blodgett, along with his brother Azil, they helped to recruit some more boys from Waukegan in the surrounding area to volunteer. They are also working with Isaac Clark to get some men volunteering. They aren't able to secure enough men to form a complete company, but they work with Joe Davies' company to combine. And that becomes Company D of the Illinois 96th Volunteer Infantry. And Blodgett writes in the autobiography, the 96th Regiment was organized in the latter part of August 1862, in which was incorporated 4 companies from Lake County and 6 from Joe Davis. My brother A.Z. Blodgett raised one of the companies, and my brother E.A. Blodgett was made adjutant of the regiment. In the latter part of August 1863, the Battle of Chickamauga was fought, in which Illinois had a large number of troops engaged, among which was the 96th Illinois, of which my brother E.A. was the adjutant and my brother A.Z. was a captain. The captain was very badly wounded, and a dispatch was sent to me saying that his wound was dangerous and might perhaps prove fatal. I lost no time in leaving for the army. So Blodgett heads out to go pick up his brother A.Z. And A.Z. survives. So let me talk a little bit about Azil Zebulon Blodgett. During the Civil War, again, he helps raise a company of men along with Isaac L. Clark. He himself volunteers to serve in the Union Army and eventually was promoted to the rank of captain in Company D of the 96th. Captain A.Z. Blodgett took part in the battles of Chickamauga, Lookout Mountain, and Missionary Ridge, as well as the engagements of Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Blodgett returned to Waukegan following the war and started operating a stock farm for breeding and importing heavy draft horses. He has the distinction of being the first importer of Clydesdale horses in the state of Illinois, starting this career in the year 1872. Azil Blodgett went on to serve 2 terms as mayor of Waukegan in 1883 and again in 1884. That's when the mayor served 1-year terms. He also served 2 years on the Board of County Supervisors and 4 years on the Waukegan City Council. He died in Waukegan on June 8, 1916. Here we have a sketch drawing of his home at 616 North Sheridan Road. And this home is still standing today. It was landmarked as a City of Waukegan historic landmark on June 1st, 2015. This was part of a landmarking of 4 different homes which all had Civil War connections to them. And then back to Henry. He worked hard after the war for General Grant, helping Grant to get elected. So let me go to that section here for us. In 1868, General Grant was nominated for President of the United States, and I took an active part in that campaign. During the session of Congress of 1868-69, Congress passed an act providing for the appointment of circuit judges in all the federal circuits, and General Grant, in the fall of 1869, nominated Judge Drummond as the circuit judge for our circuit, and tendered me the nomination of district judge as Judge Drummond's successor. I at first hesitated about accepting the position, but as a seat upon the bench, and especially the federal bench, is a position which nearly every lawyer aspires to, as it is an honor directly in the line of his profession, I finally accepted the place, and from 1869 to 1893, I was employed as the district judge of the Northern District of Illinois. After this, he has a few other things that he does for the government. He is appointed to help resolve an issue between the United States and Great Britain over the Bering Strait, as the United States was trying to gain some control there for hunting seals. And he's got a few other things at that point too as well that he's working on. There was something, though, going on, actually, sometimes publicly, sometimes rather secretly, during this entire time, which he really doesn't put in the autobiography, unfortunately. Henry Blodgett was a staunch abolitionist, and really this was following in his parents' footsteps. When the Blodgett family moved to Downers Grove in 1836, it is said that Henry's father, Israel, was in charge of the Downers Grove Underground Railroad station stop. So his father was helping to liberate slaves. There is a little section here on how his mother felt about slavery. And it reads, "A few weeks after we got moved into our own house," so this is when they first arrive to Naperville, "a man on horseback rode up to the door, leading 2 African Americans whose hands were tied, and who were held by a rope passed from their hands to the pommel of the saddle. He asked Mother if she would give him a drink of water. She took a tin pail and a cup and went to the spring, which was not more than 5 or 6 rods from the house, filled the pail from the spring, which was full of fresh, clear water, and began giving the African Americans a drink. The fellow cursed her and asked her why in the devil she was giving water to these men. And she said that, and he asked why she had not brought water for himself. She answered that the spring was there, he could help himself, that these men couldn't do that, and therefore she was giving them the water and not him. And this was the first opportunity I had ever had to see a sample of our Southern slavery, and it was a lesson which has stayed with me through life, as it has with all other members of our family." And Henry Blodgett spoke publicly against slavery. He says that every anti-slavery meeting that was held in Northeast Illinois, he attended. In 1846, for example, he was elected the secretary of the Lake County Liberty Association. This was an anti-slavery convocation that was held in Libertyville. In 1847, in Little Fort, Henry Blodgett started printing a weekly newspaper called the Lake County Visitor. This was an anti-slavery and abolitionist newspaper, and he wrote about the issues and problems of slavery within this paper. And those are the public things. But then the secret things that the Blodgett family did to help slaves, well, that was the Underground Railroad. And Blodgett builds his house at 404 South Sheridan Road at Sheridan and Liberty Street. And, well, later one of his daughters would remember from time to time African Americans coming and going from the house late at night. And there have been stories shared that the home was an Underground Railroad station, where the Blodgett family had a secret room built off of the back porch, secret cellar room, where there they would hide runaway slaves until it was time to get them to the next Underground Railroad station. Unfortunately, like so many of the Underground Railroad houses, they are lost to time. The Blodgett home being torn down in 1849, I think. And within tearing it down, they did find what they believed to be that secret cellar off the back porch area. So the Blodgett family have Underground Railroad ties throughout the Chicagoland area, and Henry Blodgett has those ties in Waukegan as well. Henry Blodgett dies at the age of 84 on February 3rd, 1905, and he is buried in Waukegan's Oakwood Cemetery. He had retired as judge for the Northern District of Illinois just 3 years prior to his death. And at the time of his death, he also still owned 300 acres of land in Lake Bluff, Illinois. And Henry Blodgett had started accumulating this land back in the 1840s when he first arrived. And this farm would eventually grow to 300 acres in size. He would work it with his brothers. Actually, he would hire others to work it, but his brothers had some interest in it as well. And the Blodgetts called this farm Ash Meadows. Today, this is known as Crabtree Farm, and that has its own little history that's very unique. I forgot to look, see if the Lake Bluff Historical Society has any information online about Crabtree Farms, but it is a place you can visit, and I'm sure, and I know that story is told at the Lake Bluff Historical Society at their museum. So there we have it. The Blodgett family, some of their influences. I didn't do all of it. There's a lot that this family was doing in early Chicagoland area, early Waukegan. Abolitionists, Underground Railroad conductors, prominent judge, influential with the railroads, the city name change, just to name a few of the things that they were a part of. In particular, Henry was a part of. And again, please check out the new Waukegan History Museum companion app. And I look forward to talking about the past with you in the future. This is Ty Rohrer signing off. Everyone, please have a great weekend.